Hey everyone, James here from the Flying Guillotine YouTube channel. Today bringing you another review. Unfortunately, there was the passing away of Wang Yu. I hadn't planned on doing this review, but I watched this film this week after his passing, and I really enjoyed it. I think it's really underrated and very underseen as far as these Cheh Wang Yu films. There are obviously some of the classics that get mentioned. The One Armed Swordsman, which is a great film. I love it. So I'm not going to talk trash on that. But I think The Assassin is, just as good a film as that film. And I think every bit worth checking out as well. Okay, so The Assassin. That's the film I'm talking about. Not to be confused with the Ho Xiao Qian film from 2015, I think. That's quite good, too. I like that film. Very different film, though. Okay, The Assassin, early Shaw Brothers. Here's the synopsis. Yu is a two-armed swordsman who is betrayed by a jealous rival, but initially seeks a life of simple pleasures until an accidental meeting with another patriot sets him back on the road to bloody, brutal vengeance. Alright, so that's their synopsis. I, first of all, like how Wang Yu is so associated with being a one-armed swordsman that it needs to be specified that he has both arms here. It's a little bit longer than average Shaw Brothers film. Mine clocked in at 1 hour and 52 minutes. A lot of these films are right at the 90-minute mark, so that's an extra 22 minutes. You do feel that at certain points, but I think for the most part, this is a fairly ambitious, more ambitious than your standard Shaw Brothers Chang-Cheh film, and I think it largely does pay off. So one thing I wanted to talk about is sort of the Japanese influence. I think specifically on a lot of these early 1960s Shaw Brothers films. Come Drink With Me, I think was 66 that came out, and that really sparked this boom. And I think one thing that I was reading that the Shaw Brothers really encouraged their directors to do, which of course would include Chang-Cheh, is to study the films of Kurosawa, but also, I think most importantly in this case, Hideo Gosha. Hideo Gosha is one of those Japanese genre directors that I think is really good and a little bit underrated. He worked a lot in the 60s and the 70s, worked for about 30 years, and he did a film called Three Outlaw Samurai that did get released by the Criterion. And so if you watch these early Chang-Cheh films, you can really see that probably most obviously in The Magnificent Trio, which is more or less a Chang-Cheh remake of the Three Outlaw Samurai, starring Wang Yu and Lo Lian. And it's an okay film. I think the original by Gosha is a little better. That film came out in 1966, and this film came out in 1967. I don't think there's as much of a direct remake that this is riffing off of as so much as there is just little parts of it that made me feel like, I think I know kind of where they're getting the influence and stuff like that from, or this feels like a little bit influenced by the Japanese samurai films of Gosha or someone like that. First of all, I think one of the very obvious influences is just in kind of our main character, played by Wang Yu here, who is playing a character whose master gets killed, and so he is basically reduced to a lower status in terms of like having to work to provide for his family, and sort of being tied between that and a desire to take vengeance. A lot of these Japanese films, too, these samurai films, have a Ronin, who is a masterless samurai, which basically is what Wang Yu becomes after his teacher dies. It's not exactly the same, but it's kind of similar, or at least operates on a similar dynamic here. And so these Ronin are sort of like these impoverished samurai who are these warriors that are kind of detached from society due to their master's death. I think in many ways the Wang Yu character that describes quite well in this film. And I think that dynamic, is quite interesting. So I think you can sort of see that influence coming through the plot. Another thing that's more visually done is the poses that they take, the power poses. There's moments where Wang Yu will hold the position and hold the sword. And sorry, I'm not good at these poses. But that's like a big thing. And especially watch the films starring Tatsuya Nakadai, any of them by Gosha, by Masaki Kobayashi, Sword of Doom by Okamoto Kiyachi. And these Japanese films are much less action films than a lot of these martial arts films coming out of Hong Kong during the time, and the action is less thrilling, but there is this formal elegance and the way that the warriors are shot that, especially when it comes to a powerful presence like Nakadai, that is very, very striking. And I feel like you are getting some of that same DNA coming across here, specifically in how Wang Yu is told to act. So that's one thing that has always crossed me too. And I think as sort of these Hong Kong martial arts films and the Shaw Brothers films sort of had their own time to develop and evolve, they sort of started to move a little bit more in their own direction here. But seeing these really, really early films that are just really the kung fu martial arts genre in its infancy, I think it's really interesting to see those influences coming through pretty clearly, in my opinion, too. So I really enjoyed that. I think one thing that this film does is those themes are quite interesting, and how the lead is sort of torn between is this sort of like lower class figure who basically can only offer sort of his strength to it as a basically skill that people would want. So when people are trying to basically give him things, everyone is kind of like naturally suspicious to it. I think these things are allowed to develop a little bit more leisurely because of its longer runtime. And I think it's quite interesting, and I think it works. I think while there is a little bit of flubber in the middle, probably could have cut out, I don't know, 5 minutes or something like that. For the most part, this film it does not feel like it's a especially long Shaw Brothers film too. But it does feel like it has a little bit more well-developed, richer themes that go a little bit further. There's a point here where Wang Yu is talking just kind of philosophically about life, about how he could grow old and get weaker as time goes on with sort of the love of his life, or he can do a glorious death. Because this is a Cheh film, and because it's Wang Yu, the glorious death is the thing that obviously has the most appeal to him. He's also kind of torn between familial duty and how he needs to provide for his mom and sister at a certain point. So I think it's all those things are at work here. I think Wang Yu does a good job, and he is up to the task of sort of carrying this film. But I think sort of that Japanese influence and sort of these familial stuff, I think it's really, really interesting. I did read a Letterboxd review talking about how the samurai are more detached from sort of family and stuff, so they don't need to worry about that. I would refer that person to some of the films by Aichi Kudo, who came out, who did 3 samurai revenge films that came out in the 60s too, that are really, really great and are largely men on a mission films. I think you can see a little bit of that DNA in here too, because those films all have sort of like this wealthy benefactor that basically is going to give, basically sponsor the assassination, so to speak, for Wang Yu. Those films have a little bit of different feel because it's men on a mission, but they kind of do tackle similar themes. And in one of those films, one of the samurai who was doing this sort of righteous vengeance that he has to do actually decides to just kill his own family in order to do the mission. And it's a very, very sad scene when we see the aftermath of what actually occurs. But my point being that these samurai films do struggle with sort of that familial nature too, and the need to take revenge, and how those tensions between those do struggle. Alright, so just a little bit more. I think the film's first act in sort of establishing the Wang Yu as this very, very promising student who is a favorite of his teacher is really strong. There's a lot of good action in the first part of it. It almost feels like we do a complete film early on, where it's almost a complete revenge film, where the person that betrays the teacher is also killed in the first act. So it's almost like its own little mini film there. So there's a lot of action there. And then we almost have a full hour of just melodrama and just stuff of interplay between Wang Yu and the characters around him. I think it's also interesting and a little bit going against the norm and playing with sort of the genre standards, in the sense that the characters that are often killed are not the obvious ones. Usually the way that we value life in sort of these cinematic universes is that we're not going to kill kids or older people or something like that, or it's more taboo to these things, and so you're killing certain types of people tend to get killed first. In this film, it's kind of flipped on its head. We have a son who is killed rather than his dad, and we have, I think, an older person that's also killed as well. So I think it's interesting just to see the way that these things are subverted a little bit with this film too. The third act has a very satisfying revenge story. It's almost like they took note that they were taking their time of them, and they just decided to have a very, very bloodthirsty last 15 to 20 minutes. In that sense, it does remind me a lot of the samurai films again, where it's one against many. Of course, that's something that would be repeated again and again in a lot of these martial arts films too. This film, I think, is really quite violent for the 1960s. It's not as bloody as Cheh would get. I think the blood would start to flow, but more. But I do think it's quite interesting and quite violent. The way that Wang Yu's character eventually does decide to kill himself, again, reminiscent of the Japanese, and decides to disfigure his face, basically, in order so his family wouldn't have vengeance sought after them. Really violent, really creative, very much Cheh, very much feels like kind of that influence. And yeah, I think it's interesting that these films are canonized. Oftentimes it feels like there's only room for one or two. In the case of early Cheh, it feels like people have kind of settled on One Armed Swordsman. I think this film's just as good. I think it's really, really worthy in that sense of being celebrated in the same way. So if you've already seen some of those films, definitely check this film out. Who won? I'm going to give it just jointly to Cheh and Jimmy Wang Yu. Both are great. I think if either of them is not up to the challenge, this film is not quite as good. But I think both are, and so the film works really well. So rating, 8 out of 10. Really good film. Sorry, one last point I just wanted to add at the end of this is that it's interesting the way that Cheh was just really getting a lot of reps really fast. This came out just 1 year after Magnificent Trio, and it feels like he's just far more comfortable at the peak of his powers. Hideo Gosha directed probably 15, 20 films in the span of 25 or 30 years. So pretty typical for Japanese directors around that era. But Cheh directed something like 85 films within like 15 to 20 years. So it's incredible the way the man worked. And as a result of just working and doing a lot of reps and stuff like that, the man learned fast. And I think this film is really impressive. So I encourage everyone to check out the works of early Cheh.